Most people think old cities are remembered for what happened there. Wars, fires, celebrations, disasters. Those are the things that end up in books. But the truth is, old cities survive because of what keeps happening, quietly, every single day, without anyone paying attention. They survive on repetition, on habit, on ordinary mornings that look almost identical to the ones before them. This channel is a place for slow stories, ordinary moments, and calm voices. Stories with no rush, no lessons to learn, and nothing you need to remember. Just simple scenes, steady pacing, and gentle words meant to help your mind slow down and rest. Now, let's begin. The old city woke up the same way it always had, not with sound, but with temperature. The air changed first. It cooled the stone streets that had held on to yesterday's warmth through the night. That coolness slid into narrow alleys and stayed there, lingering between walls that had been standing longer than most names had been remembered. The buildings leaned slightly toward one another, their surfaces uneven, their windows placed where hands and guesses had decided, not rulers or plans. A wooden shutter opened on the third floor of a tall, narrow house. The hinge made a tired sound, low and familiar, a sound that belonged to this exact hour. The man who opened it did not look outside right away. He stood still, one hand resting on the wood, letting the air touch his face. He had learned long ago that the air told the truth faster than the sky did. Below him, the street was empty except for a gray cat sitting near a shallow drain. The cat's tail was wrapped neatly around its paws, its body still, eyes half closed. It had likely been awake for hours already, watching nothing in particular, satisfied with the fact that the city would move when it was ready. The man from the narrow house crossed the street and stood near the bakery, not because he was hungry, but because that was where he stood most mornings. He folded his hands and watched the street fill slowly, the way a tide comes in without waves. Nothing dramatic happened. No one shouted, no bells rang. There were no announcements, no interruptions. The old city did not believe in spectacle, especially in the morning. Mornings here were not meant to impress anyone. They were meant to arrive, settle in, and quietly make space for the rest of the day to follow. The street accepted more movement gradually, the way it accepted everything else. Nothing arrived suddenly. A second cart rolled into the square, lighter than the first, carrying empty wooden crates stacked with care. The wheels made a soft, repeating sound against the stone, familiar enough to be ignored. The driver guided the cart to the side and stopped without looking around. He adjusted one crate, then another, making sure they sat evenly, then rested his hands on the edge of the cart as if there were nowhere else he needed to be. A door opened somewhere above street level. The sound traveled down the narrow space between buildings. A pair of shoes appeared on the small landing outside the door, placed neatly side by side. They remained there for a moment before feet stepped into them. Laces were tied slowly, double knotted out of habit rather than necessity. When the door closed again, the shoes stayed where they were, as if they belonged more to the building than to the person who wore them. The gray cat near the drain shifted its weight and stood, stretching one leg at a time. It arched its back briefly, then relaxed again. After taking a few unhurried steps, it stopped, reconsidered the effort, and settled into a new patch of shade. From there, it watched the street without expectation, confident that nothing would surprise it. Inside the bakery, trays were rotated. The baker did this every morning, even when there was no real need. He wiped his hands on his apron and glanced at the clock on the wall. The clock ran slightly slow. It always had. He trusted it more than accurate clocks because it matched the pace of the street outside. A man carrying folded papers crossed the square. He placed them on a wooden stand near the old bench, stacking them carefully so the edges lined up. He did not call out. He did not check to see who was watching. People would find the papers when they were ready. Information here was never urgent. Farther down the street, a shopkeeper opened his shutters fully. The hinges resisted slightly, then gave way. Light entered the shop and settled across jars, boxes, and shelves that had not been rearranged in years. The shopkeeper stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching the interior as if seeing it for the first time that day. He liked to let the shop wake up before stepping inside. The woman who had been sweeping leaned her broom against the wall and wiped her hands on her skirt. She remained there for a moment, listening, not for voices or footsteps, but for the general sound of the street. She believed the city had a mood, and she liked to be sure it was a good one before moving on. In a nearby room, water was poured into a kettle. The sound was brief and controlled. A flame was lit beneath it, kept low. There was no rush to make it boil. Morning allowed for waiting, and waiting was considered part of the work. The man standing near the bakery shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked down the street, then back toward the square. He was not expecting anyone. He rarely was. Still, he watched, the way people once watched before schedules had replaced curiosity. A child appeared briefly at an upper window, face pressed close to the glass. The child's expression was serious, focused entirely on the street below. After a few seconds, the child disappeared, pulled away by something unseen. Childhood passed through the old city quietly, learning early how to fit itself into narrow spaces. The sun lowered itself further into the streets, warming the stone underfoot. The color of the walls shifted slightly, becoming softer, less gray. People noticed these changes without naming them. They adjusted their steps, their hands, their breathing, without realizing why. The bench near the fountain finally received its first visitor of the day. An older man sat down carefully, testing the wood before settling fully. He rested his hands on his knees and looked straight ahead. He did not sigh, he did not fidget. He simply sat, as if this moment had been waiting for him. The fountain remained dry. A few leaves had collected at its base. No one bothered to move them. By late morning, the street would fill in its own restrained way. Conversations would happen in low voices, brief and unremarkable. Small purchases would be made without ceremony. Doors would open and close. The cart would be unloaded. The papers would be picked up one by one. For now, the old city continued exactly as it always had, unimpressed by time, uninterested in change, trusting that ordinary life, repeated carefully and without attention, was more than enough.
The afternoon arrived gently, as if the day had been stretching quietly all morning and finally decided to settle. The sunlight softened as it filtered between the narrow buildings, touching walls and window panes in uneven golden patches. Shadows shifted slowly across the stone, stretching and bending in ways only visible if one watched long enough. No one rushed to notice them. The city did not mind. From the corner, a cart rolled down another street, its wheels making soft clicks over the uneven stones. The driver steered it carefully, avoiding the shallow dips worn into the pavement over decades. He had been doing this route for years. He knew where every crack was, where every stone would catch or release the wheels. He moved without thinking, like part of the city itself. A woman emerged from a small doorway carrying a basket of goods.
She placed it on the edge of the curb, not far from the bench by the dry fountain. She moved slowly, lifting and setting the basket carefully, adjusting its position so it would not wobble. Then she stood still, her hands resting lightly on the basket, watching the cart pass before returning inside. The basket remained on the curb for a few moments, as if it were taking a short rest before being claimed or carried further. From a second-floor window, a man leaned out and looked at the square. He did not speak, he only observed, tilting his head slightly as if the city's movements were a puzzle he had been solving for years. Occasionally, he reached out and adjusted a shutter or a curtain, small gestures that seemed meaningless to anyone else but mattered to him. He withdrew his hand, and the city continued. The cat shifted again, stretching and yawning silently. It padded down the street, stopping at intervals to inspect small disturbances, a leaf that had fallen, a stone slightly out of place, a piece of paper that had moved from the wind. Satisfied, it curled into the shade of a doorway, tail wrapped around its paws. Nothing had changed enough to disturb it. Inside the bakery, trays were moved from one shelf to another. Dough was kneaded slowly, and a small bell above the door jingled as a customer finally entered. The sound was soft, almost hesitant. The baker did not rush. He took his time, serving the person without urgency. The exchange was brief. Words were few. Each step, each motion had a deliberate patience that belonged to the city more than the people in it. Along another street, a young boy carried a small bundle, walking carefully over the uneven stones. His mother followed from a doorway, keeping her eyes on him without speaking. He adjusted the bundle on his shoulder, paused, then continued. Their movements were quiet, respectful of the rhythm already present. The city did not hurry them, and neither did they. The sun climbed higher, touching the edges of rooftops and balconies, sending thin lines of light into alleyways that had not seen direct sunlight for years. Dust motes floated slowly in the beams, glinting briefly before settling again. People passed through the light without noticing, their movements blending into the long, measured pace of the day. The fountain remained still and dry. Leaves drifted around its base. A stray paper from the cart earlier had landed in its corner, fluttering slightly before coming to rest. The bench nearby had a second person now, sitting quietly and leaning back against the wood. They watched the square, though they did not see anything particularly new. Sitting was enough. Observing without interference was enough. Somewhere a door creaked open, and the smell of bread floated into the street, mingling with the scent of damp stone and faint smoke from chimneys. The mixture was unremarkable, but comforting, familiar, as if the city itself had inhaled and exhaled the scents every day for generations. The man who had stood near the bakery earlier walked slowly down the street, hands folded behind his back. He paused at intervals, adjusting his stride to match the stones beneath his feet. Occasionally, he lifted his gaze, not at anyone in particular, but at the collection of walls, windows, and rooftops, forming the city he had known all his life. By late afternoon, the streets had taken on a softer warmth. Shadows had lengthened further. The city continued to move, but slower, quieter, as if preparing itself for evening. Windows began to close slightly. Shutters were lowered just enough to soften the light inside, and people adjusted their positions in small, habitual ways. Nothing remarkable happened. No one made a scene. No sudden events disturbed the day. The city continued in its ordinary, repeated rhythm, relying on small movements, slow gestures, and the unspoken understanding that life, in its quiet consistency, was enough. Even as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the pace remained unchanged. The old city did not hurry, did not complain, and did not falter. Its streets, walls, windows, and stone steps had seen centuries of repetition, and yet they seemed content to continue exactly as they always had, letting ordinary life unfold, one small, quiet moment at a time.
The afternoon arrived gently, as if the day had been stretching quietly all morning and finally decided to settle. The sunlight softened as it filtered between the narrow buildings, touching walls and window panes in uneven golden patches. Shadows shifted slowly across the stone, stretching and bending in ways only visible if one watched long enough. No one rushed to notice them. The city did not mind. From the corner, a cart rolled down another street, its wheels making soft clicks over the uneven stones. The driver steered it carefully, avoiding the shallow dips worn into the pavement over decades. He had been doing this route for years. He knew where every crack was, where every stone would catch or release the wheels. He moved without thinking, like part of the city itself. A woman emerged from a small doorway, carrying a basket of goods. She placed it on the edge of the curb, not far from the bench by the dry fountain. She moved slowly, lifting and setting the basket carefully, adjusting its position so it would not wobble. Then she stood still, her hands resting lightly on the basket, watching the cart pass before returning inside. The basket remained on the curb for a few moments, as if it were taking a short rest before being claimed or carried further. From a second-floor window, a man leaned out and looked at the square. He did not speak, he only observed, tilting his head slightly as if the city's movements were a puzzle he had been solving for years. Occasionally, he reached out and adjusted a shutter or a curtain, small gestures that seemed meaningless to anyone else but mattered to him. He withdrew his hand, and the city continued. The cat shifted again, stretching and yawning silently. It padded down the street, stopping at intervals to inspect small disturbances, a leaf that had fallen, a stone slightly out of place, a piece of paper that had moved from the wind. Satisfied, it curled into the shade of a doorway, tail wrapped around its paws. Nothing had changed enough to disturb it. Inside the bakery, trays were moved from one shelf to another. Dough was kneaded slowly, and a small bell above the door jingled as a customer finally entered. The sound was soft, almost hesitant. The baker did not rush. He took his time, serving the person without urgency. The exchange was brief. Words were few. Each step, each motion had a deliberate patience that belonged to the city more than the people in it. Along another street, a young boy carried a small bundle, walking carefully over the uneven stones. His mother followed from a doorway, keeping her eyes on him without speaking. He adjusted the bundle on his shoulder, paused, then continued. Their movements were quiet, respectful of the rhythm already present. The city did not hurry them, and neither did they. The sun climbed higher, touching the edges of rooftops and balconies, sending thin lines of light into alleyways that had not seen direct sunlight for years. Dust motes floated slowly in the beams, glinting briefly before settling again. People passed through the light without noticing, their movements blending into the long, measured pace of the day. The fountain remained still and dry. Leaves drifted around its base. A stray paper from the cart earlier had landed in its corner, fluttering slightly before coming to rest. The bench nearby had a second person now, sitting quietly and leaning back against the wood. They watched the square, though they did not see anything particularly new. Sitting was enough. Observing without interference was enough. Somewhere a door creaked open, and the smell of bread floated into the street, mingling with the scent of damp stone and faint smoke from chimneys. The mixture was unremarkable, but comforting, familiar, as if the city itself had inhaled and exhaled the scents every day for generations. The man who had stood near the bakery earlier walked slowly down the street, hands folded behind his back. He paused at intervals, adjusting his stride to match the stones beneath his feet. Occasionally, he lifted his gaze, not at anyone in particular, but at the collection of walls, windows, and rooftops,
forming the city he had known all his life. By late afternoon, the streets had taken on a softer warmth. Shadows had lengthened further. The city continued to move, but slower, quieter, as if preparing itself for evening. Windows began to close slightly. Shutters were lowered just enough to soften the light inside, and people adjusted their positions in small, habitual ways. Nothing remarkable happened. No one made a scene. No sudden events disturbed the day. The city continued in its ordinary, repeated rhythm, relying on small movements, slow gestures, and the unspoken understanding that life, in its quiet consistency, was enough. Even as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the pace remained unchanged. The old city did not hurry, did not complain, and did not falter. Its streets, walls, windows, and stone steps had seen centuries of repetition, and yet they seemed content to continue exactly as they always had, letting ordinary life unfold, one small, quiet moment at a time.
As the sun began its slow descent, the city changed almost imperceptibly. The golden warmth that had touched the streets and rooftops all afternoon softened into a mellow amber, spilling across the stones in long, uneven bands. Shadows stretched and leaned against the walls, moving with a deliberate slowness that mirrored the heartbeat of the streets. The people moved in rhythm with the light, pausing at intervals, adjusting their pace to the sun's retreat, unhurried, unpressured. The baker closed the large window of the shop, leaving only a thin crack for ventilation. The trays were stacked carefully, the dough put aside to rest, and the smell of freshly baked bread lingered lightly in the air, soft enough to blend with the cool scent of stone and evening. Outside, the first lanterns began to glow faintly, their light spilling gently over doorways and windows. They were not meant to illuminate everything, only enough to make the familiar paths visible and comforting. A man walked slowly through the square, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracing the edges of stone walls, window frames, and wooden shutters. He paused occasionally to observe a flicker of light inside a shop, the movement of a curtain in the breeze, the steady drip of water from an old pipe into the gutter. Nothing required attention, yet everything demanded presence. The city had a way of reminding its inhabitants that being there, quietly, was enough. The cat from earlier moved again, emerging from the shade of a doorway. Its steps were soft, deliberate. It passed over sun-warmed stones that had cooled just enough to feel pleasant beneath its paws. It paused by the fountain, sniffing lightly at the scattered leaves and the single scrap of paper that had not moved all day. Content, it returned to a shadowed corner, tail wrapped neatly around its body, eyes half closed, surveying without expectation. Inside the narrow houses, evening routines began. Water was poured slowly into kettles, small fires were lit, and lamps were prepared for the coming night. The motions were measured, almost ceremonial in their steadiness. No one hurried. Cups were filled, bread sliced carefully, and chairs were pulled closer to tables, yet the movements were so quiet that they might have gone unnoticed had the city not been attentive. A boy appeared at a window above the street, face pressed lightly to the glass. He watched the square without speaking, fingers tracing patterns on the pane. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across his face. He remained there for a while, learning patience, learning to see without interfering. Then he withdrew, leaving only the faint outline of the pane reflecting the lanterns that had begun to glow. In the alleys, small carts were returned to their resting places. Wooden wheels clicked softly against stone as they were guided carefully, then left leaning against walls, waiting for tomorrow. A shopkeeper wiped down counters and shelves, adjusting jars and boxes with quiet attention. The city did not demand perfection, only the presence of care, a respect for routine.
The fountain, still dry, now held the shadows of trees and the gentle flicker of lantern light. Leaves drifted across the stones, and a small breeze shifted the paper at its base, moving it just enough to remind anyone passing that even stillness contained subtle motion. A bench nearby held two people now, sitting silently, leaning slightly toward each other, speaking only in low tones, if at all. They did not need to fill the space with words. Their presence, steady and measured, was enough. Shutters began to close more fully as windows darkened. The soft glow of lamps within provided warmth without intrusion. People moved between rooms with slow, deliberate steps, setting down their day's objects, attending to small details. A cloth straightened here, a candle lit there, a chair pulled gently closer. Nothing was hurried, nothing demanded recognition. The city accepted it all without comment. The cat shifted again, stretching and yawning without sound, before curling into a new patch of shadow. Its movements were mirrored by a few humans walking slowly home along the streets. Steps were soft against the stones, shoes placed carefully to avoid unnecessary noise. Conversations, when they happened, were muted and brief, words chosen lightly, carried lightly, fading quickly into the ambient quiet. Lanterns multiplied across the streets, their glow uneven, warm, and comforting. They highlighted the cracks in walls, the curves of steps, the edges of rooftops. Shadows leaned and lengthened, stretching across squares, alleys, and corners. The light did not try to banish darkness, only to coexist with it, a gentle guidance rather than a demand. A delivery cart moved for the last time today, wheels clicking over stones worn smooth by generations. Crates were stacked, unloaded, and left carefully. The driver paused at intervals, adjusting the load, checking the balance. Then, satisfied, he left the square slowly, the sound of wheels fading into the quiet of the evening. Inside the houses, fires were tended in small stoves, the faint aroma of cooked meals mingling with the warm stone scent of the city. Lamps flickered slightly as the air moved, shadows dancing softly across walls and ceilings. People paused between tasks, leaning lightly on tables or counters, observing their surroundings, noticing small details, the way a curtain swayed, a leaf stuck against a window, the fading colors of a wall. Nothing was urgent, and everything mattered. From an upper window, the man who had spent the day observing the square finally lowered himself onto the sill, resting. He watched the city without moving much, absorbing the quiet rhythm. The sun had almost disappeared beyond the rooftops, leaving the streets in a soft twilight, the lanterns painting gentle light on the stones. The fountain, the benches, the scattered papers, all remained. Nothing had changed significantly, yet the city felt different. The light softened textures, shifted the colors of stone and wood, made familiar paths feel slightly new. Even routine had its small surprises if one paid attention long enough. A few doors opened briefly as residents tended to small chores, washing, sweeping, placing objects in order. Each movement was slow, deliberate. There was no hurry, no expectation of acknowledgement. The city, in its long history, had trained its inhabitants to move in harmony with it, to trust that ordinary actions carried meaning even when unnoticed. The cat yawned again and stretched, settling finally into a small alcove under a balcony. It watched the shadows, the flickering lights, the subtle movements of people passing beneath. The streets were almost empty now, a few silhouettes drifting slowly. Each step seemed measured, almost ceremonial in its quiet way. By nightfall, the square was largely still. Lanterns glowed softly, marking paths, entrances, and edges. The fountain's dry stones held the shadows of leaves and branches, and the benches remained, empty now, waiting for the next day's quiet occupants. Windows glowed gently, flickering with candlelight, lamplight, and the faint reflection of evening. The old city exhaled as night settled fully. Stones cooled, walls darkened, and the streets, familiar and unremarkable, embraced silence. The rhythm of life continued, but slower, quieter, softer. The city's heartbeat had not changed. It was simply quieter now, waiting for tomorrow. Even in darkness, the old city moved in subtle ways. Doors creaked open, shutters adjusted themselves in slight drafts, shadows shifted imperceptibly. The smell of warmed stone, faint smoke, and baked goods lingered in some alleys. Small lights glimmered behind windows, creating gentle patterns on walls. All was ordinary. All was enough. And so the old city slept lightly, not in sudden stillness, but in measured continuation. It had always been this way. It would remain this way tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Life unfolded in small, quiet increments, repeated carefully, observed respectfully, and trusted entirely. In its repetition, the city found permanence, comfort, and the quiet satisfaction of being exactly what it was: ordinary, slow, and endlessly patient.
Midnight arrived quietly. The streets were mostly empty now, save for a few lingering figures moving without purpose or urgency. Lanterns flickered softly, casting thin streams of light that stretched across walls and cobblestones, illuminating only fragments of the city at a time. The shadows were long, deep, and forgiving. They moved slowly, stretching across alleyways, gathering in corners, curling around doorways as if protecting the city from the absence of sunlight. A single cart rested against a wall, wheels still, crates stacked carefully. The driver had already gone home, but the memory of movement lingered. The faint creak of wood under the slight shift of a breeze reminded the city that life, even when paused, was never fully still. From somewhere above, a window opened slightly, letting out a faint scent of herbs steeping in water. The resident inside did not speak. She moved slowly, attending to small tasks with a quiet precision, her presence barely noticeable beyond the soft sound of water pouring into a cup. The old fountain remained dry, holding the moonlight and the shadows of nearby trees. A few leaves drifted lazily across its stone basin, brushing the edges as they passed. The bench nearby was empty, but the memory of people sitting there lingered in the texture of the worn wood. Even in stillness, the city carried the echoes of routine, the subtle traces of its inhabitants' careful movements. The cat stirred from its alcove, stretching luxuriously, then slinking through the shadows. Its paws made no sound. It paused at intervals, sniffing the faint traces of meals, the lingering warmth of footsteps, the ghost of a leaf drifting across the stone. When satisfied, it disappeared down a narrow alley, merging with the darkness, leaving only the faintest impression on the night air. Inside the narrow houses, candles flickered in small rooms. The flame illuminated walls, revealing cracks, worn paint, and the faint outline of objects placed carefully. Water continued to drip from old pipes, steady and rhythmic, echoing lightly in quiet corridors. The sound blended with the occasional shuffle of a person moving about, attending to minor tasks, stacking dishes, folding linens, adjusting blankets. Nothing hurried, nothing demanded attention. Even small gestures held weight in this calm environment. A man leaned from his window, arms resting on the sill, watching the square below. He observed slowly, intentionally, absorbing the city's silence. Occasionally he adjusted a shutter or straightened a curtain, minor acts that might have seemed insignificant but were part of the evening's rhythm. No one else noticed. None needed to. The city required only observation, not acknowledgement.
The moonlight traced over rooftops, revealing uneven tiles and warped chimneys, the silhouettes of antennas and clotheslines stretching across narrow passages. It cast long shadows into alleys where doors remained slightly ajar, waiting. The city exhaled with the night, settling into a subtle pulse that was neither fast nor slow, but steady. From a distant alley, the faint sound of footsteps echoed. A solitary figure moved with care, stopping occasionally to glance down side streets, to avoid loose stones, to shift the weight of a small bundle carried quietly. Every step was deliberate. No sound lingered long enough to disturb the surrounding stillness. The city absorbed movement gently, almost like water taking a pebble dropped into a pond. A window high above opened once more, just a crack. A child peeked out, drawn by the faint flicker of lanterns below. Their eyes traced shadows, the outlines of familiar rooftops, the occasional glint of glass reflecting soft light. The child did not speak. They simply watched, learning patience, learning how silence could be active without being loud. The fountain's basin shimmered faintly under the moon, leaves shifting slowly. The bench nearby remained empty. Every step, every leaf, every shift of shadow was observed by the city itself. Life had slowed to a minimal beat, and yet it had not ceased entirely. The city was aware of its heartbeat in these moments of midnight, steady and unbroken. Inside the houses, the last tasks of the day were completed slowly. Water poured carefully, lamps adjusted, doors closed with gentle attention. Small noises, wood creaking, glass clinking, fabric rustling, filled the spaces in measured ways. No one hurried, no one needed to. Each sound was absorbed into the rhythm of the city, each motion folded into the fabric of ordinary nightlife. A soft wind drifted through narrow alleys, stirring leaves, brushing against stone walls. It carried with it faint scents of smoke, damp earth, and baked goods that had been left to cool. The scents mingled, subtle and comforting, unnoticed except for those who paused long enough to inhale. The cat reappeared briefly, slinking along a narrow ledge, tail low, ears twitching at the quiet sounds. It stopped to examine a faint movement, a shadow, a leaf, perhaps nothing at all. Then it continued, blending seamlessly into the darkness, leaving only the faintest impression on the night air. Lanterns flickered gently across the streets, their light moving slightly in the night air. They highlighted the textures of walls, the edges of doorways, the subtle curves of steps. Shadows shifted slowly with the flames, stretching and receding in a rhythm that felt natural, unforced. The city's geometry was alive in the night, every corner and surface participating in the quiet dance. From a distant house, the faint scrape of a chair moving across a floor could be heard. Inside, a person adjusted a blanket, set down a book, and paused. The sound was small, almost polite, absorbed by the city without resistance. Every object, every wall, every stone contributed to a calm that was at once persistent and invisible. By the middle of the night, only a few residents remained active, their movements measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The streets were mostly empty, but the city itself moved with subtle life, lanterns swaying, shadows stretching, old pipes dripping, cats prowling, curtains shifting slightly. Every element contributed to a rhythm that no one had to force or announce. The moon reached its highest point, casting soft, diffused light across rooftops. Windows glowed faintly, curtains framing amber lamps inside. A distant dog barked once, quickly fading into silence. The echo was absorbed by walls and alleyways, leaving no mark. The night continued in its measured, careful way. Toward the pre-dawn hours, the city began to sense the approaching change in light. Shadows lengthened and softened simultaneously, stretching toward walls, but receding as the first hints of pale sky began to touch the rooftops. Lanterns continued to glow, now competing subtly with the emerging light. The streets remained almost empty, silent except for the smallest noises, the shift of a stone, the drip of water, the faint rustle of leaves. The fountain remained dry, holding the soft, shifting light. The bench nearby awaited the day's first visitor. Doors creaked open briefly as residents made minor adjustments, preparing for the slow transition toward morning. The cat returned to its alcove, curling up and closing its eyes, satisfied that the night's rhythm had not been disturbed. The old city existed as it always had, patient, calm, persistent, observing without judgment. Every subtle movement, every faint noise, every flicker of light was part of its continuous life. The city, in its ordinary, repeated, patient existence, found satisfaction in each quiet, unnoticed moment. And so the night passed, slowly, unremarkably, perfectly ordinary. The city's heartbeat remained steady, unbroken, and eternal.
The first hint of light appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly, brushing the edges of rooftops with a faint silvery glow. The sky itself seemed to hesitate, holding somewhere between night and day, neither committing fully to darkness nor brightness. Shadows that had dominated the streets began to thin, stretching and flattening as the soft light crept across stone walls, wooden shutters, and uneven cobblestones. The lanterns, which had burned faithfully through the night, glimmered faintly in response, their flames dimming slightly as if acknowledging the new presence. A cool breeze moved through the narrow alleys, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and faint remnants of yesterday's meals. Leaves stirred gently, drifting across the dry fountain, brushing the edges and creating soft, uneven patterns on the stones. The cat, still curled in its alcove, stretched in small increments, rolling onto its side and back before settling upright and observing the faint illumination with half-closed eyes. Its tail flicked once, then rested again, as if to mark the slow passage of time. Windows on the upper floors began to shift, shutters opening slightly to admit the pale light. A hand appeared from one window, brushing a curtain aside and letting the soft glow filter through. The movement was deliberate and unhurried, almost ceremonial. Inside the room, a small kettle was placed on the stove. Water poured slowly into it, and a faint flame flickered under the metal. Steam began to rise in quiet, curling shapes, dissolving into the gentle light. From the street below, a faint sound of footsteps echoed, irregular and careful. A man walked slowly, adjusting his stride to the uneven stones beneath his feet. He paused periodically, glancing toward the fountain, the empty benches, the shifting leaves. Nothing demanded attention, yet everything was observed. The city seemed to notice him more than he noticed the city, a quiet acknowledgement exchanged in absence of words. The baker opened the shutters fully now, allowing more light to enter the shop. The trays from yesterday remained stacked neatly, but new ones were prepared, dusted off and lined up. Dough was kneaded in slow, even movements, the sound soft and measured. The aroma began to drift outside, mingling with the morning air, subtle but present. Across the street, a woman emerged with a small basket, placing it carefully near a doorway before adjusting her clothing and disappearing back inside. The cat moved down the street, paws silent, tail low, ears attentive. It paused briefly at the fountain, sniffing at the edges of the leaves and the faint scrap of paper that had not moved for hours. Then it continued toward the shadows of an alley, pausing occasionally to examine small disturbances, a leaf lifted by the wind, a stone slightly out of place, a scrap of paper brushing another. The rhythm of its movements matched the subtle pulse of the city, neither hurried nor aimless.
Inside the narrow houses, the faint glow of lamps complemented the growing light. Curtains shifted in slight drafts. Objects were moved slowly and deliberately. A woman wiped a surface, straightened a chair, and paused to observe the street through a partially open window. The air carried the scent of bread, herbs, and faint smoke, mingling with the stone and wood of the buildings. Every sound was quiet, measured, absorbed immediately into the natural rhythm of the awakening city. From a second-floor window, a young boy appeared, face pressed lightly to the glass. He watched the square below, noting the shifting shadows, the movement of leaves, the faint reflection of light on the wet stones. His hands traced patterns slowly on the window pane before being withdrawn. He stepped back, leaving the window partially open, letting in the fresh, cool air of the early morning. The fountain remained dry, but transformed under the first light. The leaves shimmered in the soft glow, and the edges of the stone caught pale highlights, revealing textures unseen in the night. The benches nearby remained empty for now, their wood smooth and worn, waiting silently for someone to sit and become part of the city's measured rhythm. A single cart appeared from a side street, wheels clicking softly against the stones. The driver moved deliberately, guiding the cart carefully around dips and cracks, setting down its contents one at a time. No words were exchanged. The movement was slow, precise, part of the city's ordinary unfolding. Nearby, a shopkeeper opened a door fully for the first time that morning, letting light spill across the entrance. Shelves inside revealed jars and boxes, untouched, perfectly aligned from yesterday's work. The air began to carry the faint warmth of the sun, soft and indirect, brushing the tops of the taller buildings first, then descending gradually into the alleys and streets. Shadows continued to recede slowly, the darker shapes merging into the softened textures of stone and wood. A gentle breeze moved leaves across the square, swaying small scraps of paper and lifting dust from the streets, leaving faint trails in its wake. The man from earlier continued his slow passage through the square, hands clasped behind his back, observing carefully. He paused at the fountain, glancing at the empty benches, the faintly glimmering lanterns, the stone surfaces warmed slightly by the emerging light. His steps were deliberate, measured, in harmony with the subtle pulse of the awakening city. The cat returned briefly, stepping carefully along the edges of the fountain, its paws leaving no sound. It sniffed at familiar places, observed slight movements, then settled under a balcony as the first rays of sun fell across the square. Its tail curled around its body, eyes half closed, still alert but at ease. Windows opened gradually, one by one, admitting more light. Curtains shifted in faint drafts. Lamps inside were extinguished, the glow of the sun sufficient to illuminate rooms. In kitchens, kettles steamed gently. Bread was arranged for baking, and the air carried a faint mixture of warmth, flour, and quiet anticipation. Outside, a few people began to move along the streets, their steps measured, careful, and silent enough to blend with the gentle sounds of wind and rustling leaves. The fountain and bench remained central, silent witnesses to the city's slow transition. A figure approached the bench, seating themselves carefully, resting hands lightly on knees, observing the subtle transformations of light and shadow. The motion was unhurried, harmonious with the city, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. Lanterns flickered for the last time before being extinguished, their light merging with the soft glow of early morning. The streets were now filled with pale warmth, the edges of buildings, the cracks in walls, and the uneven cobblestones illuminated evenly, revealing details previously hidden in shadow. The city exhaled gently, settling fully into morning. Every stone, every wall, every shutter, every door moved into alignment with the new light. Shadows shortened and faded, leaves drifted and landed, Small sounds, the scrape of a chair, the faint clink of dishes, the soft movement of feet, blended seamlessly into the natural rhythm of the awakening streets. The cat stretched once more, then disappeared into an alley, leaving only the faint impression of motion. Windows opened fully, shutters pushed wide. People began minor routines, adjusting objects, straightening chairs, lifting water, preparing food. Nothing rushed, nothing interrupted the slow, deliberate unfolding of ordinary life. By the time the sun had risen above the rooftops, the city had fully transitioned from night to morning. Shadows were soft and short. Streets were quietly alive with the first movements of daily life. Every object, every surface, every resident was now participating in the ongoing rhythm. The city, patient and calm, had returned to its familiar pulse, steady and persistent, prepared to repeat the slow, measured cycle once again.
The city's morning unfolded quietly, without fanfare or urgency. Sunlight stretched slowly across rooftops and spilled unevenly onto the streets, touching walls, wooden shutters, and cobblestones in soft, irregular patches. The warmth was gentle, barely noticeable at first, but it began to seep steadily into the stones, softening the coolness that had lingered from the night. Shadows leaned against the walls, retreating gradually, stretching into narrower shapes before flattening entirely, their presence now subtle, almost imperceptible. The streets were still mostly empty, though not silent. Small movements echoed softly, a shutter creaked open, a door hummed faintly as it adjusted against the frame. A single shoe shifted on a doorstep. Each sound was small, deliberate, measured, absorbed immediately into the quiet rhythm of the city. The air carried the sense of stone warmed by sunlight, faint smoke, and the lingering aroma of baked goods cooling from the early hours. It was a mixture subtle enough to pass unnoticed by most, yet perceptible to those who paused to breathe deeply. From a narrow alley, a man emerged slowly, carrying a bundle of papers. He adjusted the weight on his shoulder, stepped carefully over uneven stones, and paused at intervals to observe the square. He did not speak, nor did he need to. The city received him with the same calm patience it extended to all who moved within it. The faintest flutter of a leaf in the breeze, the subtle shift of a curtain in a window, the quiet drip of water from an old pipe, all of it seemed synchronized, forming a rhythm that neither demanded attention nor insisted on hurry. The bakery's shutters were fully opened now, revealing shelves, trays, and jars bathed in the soft morning light. The baker moved deliberately, dusting surfaces, arranging trays, kneading dough in slow, even motions. The aroma of fresh bread drifted gently into the street, mingling with the faint warmth of sunlit stones. Outside, a woman placed a small basket near a doorway, adjusting it carefully before retreating inside. The basket rested quietly, unclaimed for now, waiting as if aware that morning itself was still unfolding. The cat emerged from its alcove, moving gracefully along the edges of the streets. Its paws were silent on the stones, tail low and deliberate. It paused near the dry fountain, sniffing at leaves and remnants of the night, then continued down an alley, pausing intermittently to inspect minor disturbances, a leaf lifted by a soft wind, a paper shifted by an earlier passerby. Each step, each pause was measured, perfectly harmonized with the city's gentle pulse. From above, windows began to open fully. Curtains shifted in the slight breeze, admitting more light into the rooms within. Small movements accompanied the illumination. A kettle set on a stove, water poured slowly into it, bread arranged for baking, chairs straightened, surfaces wiped clean. Nothing was hurried, nothing was unnecessary. The city absorbed each gesture into its rhythm, carrying it forward without need for recognition. A young boy appeared at a window,
face pressed lightly to the glass. He watched the square below, eyes tracing the interplay of light and shadow across the stones. Fingers traced slow patterns on the window pane before being withdrawn. He leaned back slightly, letting the soft warmth of sunlight wash over him as the faint morning breeze drifted in. For him, observation was a quiet act of participation, learning the rhythm of the city without needing to alter it. The fountain remained dry, but caught the morning light in subtle, shifting patterns. Leaves drifted gently across its basin, rustling softly against the stones. The nearby benches remained empty, their wood worn and smooth, waiting silently for the city's occupants to engage with them. Soon the first visitors would arrive, drawn not by urgency, but by the natural unfolding of the day. From a side street, a cart rolled gently into view. The driver guided it carefully over uneven stones, setting down its contents one at a time, pausing intermittently to adjust balance. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The motion alone spoke of rhythm, continuity, and the quiet purpose of ordinary life. Nearby, shopkeepers opened doors fully, letting sunlight spill across their interiors. Shelves revealed jars, boxes, and trays carefully arranged from the night before, unchanged and waiting. The city's air began to warm further, the sunlight slowly descending into alleys and courtyards, highlighting textures that had been hidden in shadow. Small breezes moved leaves, dust, and papers, leaving delicate, fleeting trails that were observed only by the attentive. The man from earlier continued his measured passage, pausing near the fountain, observing the subtle shifts in light, shadow, and movement. His hands remained folded behind his back, his eyes tracing the gentle transformations of the city as the morning unfolded. The cat returned briefly, moving with deliberate stealth along narrow ledges. Its tail flicked once before settling, eyes half closed in calm observation. It paused at familiar spots, sniffing, listening, absorbing the quiet rhythm of the awakening streets. The benches, the dry fountain, and the scattered leaves all became part of its journey, part of the city's continuous heartbeat. Windows opened, shutters fully adjusted, lamps extinguished. The streets became more visible in their entirety, revealing the uneven stones, the textures of walls, the subtle variations in wooden doors and metal hinges. People moved carefully along the streets, their steps measured, blending seamlessly into the soft sounds of wind, shifting leaves, and faint creaks from old buildings. The city was now fully awake, but it moved with the same gentle patience it had maintained all night. The fountain caught the sunlight fully now, its dry basin illuminating small irregularities in the stone, leaves drifting across the surface. A figure approached the bench, seating themselves slowly, hands resting lightly on knees. They observed the square, the fountain, the gentle movements of leaves and light, becoming a quiet participant in the city's rhythm. Their presence was deliberate, yet unhurried, a continuation of the subtle pulse already established. Lanterns were extinguished completely, their light merging with the morning sun. The streets were illuminated evenly, soft warmth spreading over every surface, revealing textures, cracks, and surfaces unseen in darkness. The city exhaled gently, fully transitioning from night to morning, embracing the quiet continuation of life without hurry, without demand, with a steady, patient rhythm. By mid-morning, subtle activity had begun to increase. Few residents moved slowly through the streets, opening shutters, tending to small chores, placing objects carefully, adjusting surfaces. Conversations were muted, measured, brief. Children's footsteps occasionally echoed faintly, absorbed immediately into the city's gentle rhythm. Small carts moved gradually, wheels clicking softly against stones, leaving only faint traces in the quiet streets. The fountain remained dry, but the movement of leaves, shadows, and sunlight kept it alive in perception. Benches were used occasionally, residents pausing to observe, to breathe, to participate quietly in the slow unfolding of daily life. The air carried the faint sense of warmed stone, baked goods, and small fires in stoves. Everything was ordinary, yet perfectly sufficient. The cat moved one last time through the square before retreating to a shadowed alcove. Its steps were silent, deliberate, a final acknowledgment of the morning before settling. Windows continued to open, curtains swayed gently, and people moved slowly, steadily, in tune with the city's persistent pulse. Every object, every movement, every sound became part of the continuous rhythm that defined life here. By late morning, the city was fully immersed in its gentle routine. Streets were active in soft, unhurried ways. Shopkeepers tended to shelves, residents completed chores, children watched quietly from windows. Light fell unevenly across stones, wooden shutters, and walls, revealing textures in motion, shadows lengthening and shortening with subtle changes in sun and breeze. Every step, every sound, every breath was absorbed into the quiet, patient life of the city. Even in activity, the city maintained its measured heartbeat. Nothing was hurried, nothing forced. Every motion, small, deliberate, ordinary, folded seamlessly into the rhythm established over centuries. The fountain remained still, but central, the benches holding memory and anticipation. Leaves drifted, light shifted, shadows moved, and life continued exactly as it had for generations.